Welcome to What Was the Civil War and Why Won't It Go Away? We're joined by Dr. Hilary Green, Professor of History at the University of Alabama. And this is the inaugural program associated with the deCordova Sculpture Park and Museum's two presentations, two exhibitions of the textile artist Sonya Clark. They go on view this Saturday, April 10th, and will remain on view until September 12th, 2021. So please come, and there's many more programs to follow. We're really, really lucky to have Dr. Green joining us today to set the stage. So Sonya Clark's exhibition, Monumental Cloth, The Flag We Should Know, largely examines the Confederate flag of truce, which is a little known historical object, but quite significant. The textile nature of it, the texture, the colors, the ideology behind it. And so we've invited Dr. Green here to offer us some historical context, some background behind that object and that chapter of history. Hilary Green is Associate Professor of History and Co-Director of the African American Studies program at the University of Alabama. A specialist in Civil War history and memory and the Black Atlantic, Dr. Green has published on a wide range of subjects, including the artwork of Sonya Clark. She is the author of Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890, and co-editor of the book series Reconstruction Reconsidered. I want to just mention two other projects I just learned about that Dr. Green is working on currently. So a campus history of the University of Alabama, for which she gives tours regularly, and there's actually now a virtual tour that she's offering online, but she's done in person for more than 5,000 people at this point. The project is called the Hallowed Grounds Project. And her current book project is called Unforgettable Sacrifice, and it is a history of African American remembrances of the Civil War. So I'm so excited to learn from you, Dr. Green, and to be able to think a little bit more deeply with Sonya Clark's work. Everyone, please feel free to use the comments, the chat, and the Q&A. Chat among ourselves and ask questions. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end to discuss, to ask questions, and this will be recorded and will live on our website, so feel free to check back. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And one of the things I would like to do today is really contextualize a fabulous exhibition that Sonya Clark has done. And it's really focused on the truce flag and the role of surrender in understanding the Civil War, both past and present. And one of the things I would like to hopefully contend is that we're still fighting over the way of surrendering. And what do we do with the cultural wars around the Civil War monuments that we're currently still in? And who surrender, what's the removals, and what this process like? And I think Sonya Clark really offers us some moments to really understand this project. So I was fortunate to see this exhibition in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this is a picture of it. It is a large flag of surrender made out of tea cloth material, hand dyed with materials that would have been used at the time. And it is on scale and size and scope. Really gets a question about flags, surrender, the Civil War. And she really asked us a question at the end that I will return to. What happens if we start remembering the various surrenders that happened from the beginning of the Civil War to the end? And why not this flag, but instead monuments to the Confederacy and the lost cause that get remembered, and not this one? And the ongoing battles of what the war meant that start really during the war and continue on into this post-George Floyd moment. So for me, I want to start and get us to think about surrender and how the Civil War is really much defined by surrenders. And it's multiple surrenders from the beginning of the war as well as the end of the war. And I still think in this ongoing cultural war over monuments and memory, we're still fighting and surrendering over this contentious 4-year battle and warfare that shaped the nation. So in order to start with surrenders, some basic facts about the Civil War. It really starts with the secession crisis of 1860 to 1861, in which the election of Abraham Lincoln, without any support from the Southern states, he wins without any Southern state support, that convinces South Carolina to secede from the Union in December of 1860. So one of the things most people think, like, why December? Why South Carolina? Well, they're one of the few state governments still in who are still had their legislature still in session. Most legislatures at the time, they take the Christmas months off, and so they're off on break. But South Carolina still is in session. So they are able to pass this secession ordinance, but also to the reasoning and the rationale for why they are leaving the United States. And in their laying of this framework, they really outline some of the issues surrounded about their fears and what Lincoln might do, and that there was no Southern support, and what to do with the institution of slavery. But then other states start to succeed from the Union: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, all the Deep South. And they do so before Lincoln's even inaugurated. February of that year, these states formed the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama. And on February 21st, 1861, Jefferson Davis is inaugurated as president. In his inaugural speech, he's really talking about and justifying why these states not only left the United States to form the Confederate States of America, but then too, justifying the new nation that they create. And the Confederacy and the Confederate States of America is a 4-year nation. It's short-lived. Its dates are marked by the creation here of February 21st, 1861, to the end of surrenders, but it is a short-lived 4-year nation. So he doesn't really talk about the issue of what is the foundation of the new nation. And when you look at the Confederate States of America's Constitution, it reads similar to the United States Constitution with some notable exceptions. Slavery is actually mentioned. Slave people are actually mentioned. It's not like in the original document where they used euphemism, 3/5 of other persons, imported persons, but never the word slave. And so his address really doesn't really talk about what the foundation of the nation. His vice president, though, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, really uses the speech to talk about how the centrality of slavery as the cornerstone of this new nation. And this well-known quote is talked about how they were fine-tuning and perfecting what the U.S. Constitution of the Founding Fathers did not do by recognizing the centrality of slavery, and how that is the current Constitution has forever put to rest all these agitating questions of reconciling the impending crisis of the 1850s and all these nullification crises and these battles over slavery in the territories. And that the institution of slavery was the proper status for African Americans in what they say our form of civilization. And it was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. So they use this revolutionary language to explain also their new nation. And that their new government is founded upon exact opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not the equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And I put this here because in current debates, we forget about this speech, and people choose to forget about the foundation that slavery rested of this new nation, and that the Confederacy is built upon the subordination of African Americans and how they contrast themselves with the U.S. Constitution. And I think this is very much part of our current discussions today and how this gets remembered, and I would say conveniently forgotten. But Abraham Lincoln, by the time he is inaugurating office, and it's March of 1861, he comes in to a new nation. In the process of also when he comes into the new Confederate States of America had been seizing federal property. So you already have rounds of surrenders of federal forts to now this Confederate nation. And you see surrenders being very much instrumental. So when he is inaugurating office, he uses an address to really talk about and lay out the land and what's going on. And he tries to appeal to those who've left, but he really emphasizes that if there's any war, and there's been debates over war at this point, it would be because the United States is attacked. He won't do it. He's going to wait and justify this by being attacked by the nation. And he still hopes that we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The passion may be strained, but we must come back, and our better angels of nature should come to the fore. So Lincoln, one of the first things he does is dealing with a lowly fort in the harbor of South Carolina, and that is Fort Sumter. It is running low on supplies, and they desperately need resupplying. And Lincoln orders resupplying of this fort, and he really is reads his enemies well, in this case, Jefferson Davis, and hoping that Jefferson Davis would order Beauregard to seize this fort and also kind of draw this conflict into being. And on April 12th, that's what happens. 4:15 in the morning, shots are fired, and the fort will ultimately surrender. So we had seizures and surrenders of other forts, but it's this fort that surrenders. And Lincoln, in response to this attack by the Confederate States of America on a U.S. federal fort, calls for 75,000 troops to put down this insurrection on April 15th. And it's this call for the troops is what leads to the second phase of secession. That's Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. And when these states leave, they not only leave the United States for the Confederate States of America, they automatically join. And they put that in there also in their secession ordinances, but also their justification that they immediately will join the Confederate States of America. And so we have surrenders pushing this fight to war. And in the early stages of war, surrenders happened all the time. When battles and combatants lose, people and troops and individuals would surrender. They would be captured. But you have prisoner exchanges. You have where men are treated with dignity of war, because at this time in war, people get exchanged. This is common. And sometimes those early parolees will then go back to fight into war. So you have this white man's back and forth exchange. Emancipation Proclamation changes all of that, because the preliminary version that comes after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln uses that victory, I would say it's more of a draw than a victory, to issue out that he's going to make emancipation a war claim. You still have parolees happening. It's the final Emancipation Proclamation when it gets issued on January 1st, 1863. You start to see those terms of what happened with the war, and early surrenders and exchanges kind of evaporate. One, by this time in the Civil War, surrender by the Confederate States of America is being used as a referendum of the nation and its legitimacy. To surrender is no longer honorable. It is you're betraying, in a way, the nation. For the Union side, they still will engage with paroles. They will still do exchange, but they're seeing surrender as important to end this fight. The introduction of African-American soldiers in the U.S. Army, though, and the formation of the USCT regiments really changed this war, because African-American men, those who were seen by the Confederate States of America as natural state as being subordinate, as enslaved, as not as the equals, their presence in uniform. Even those who escaped and liberate themselves and then join up were seen as a betrayal of the war and whiteness, and all former negotiations on surrender will change. You stop seeing paroles happening. And while African-American men see this fight and their entrance as a way to fight for their freedom and free enslaved people in the states still in rebellion, they are promoting a vision of manhood, and that wearing the uniform is able to cement and get their true equality. So while this leads to the abolition of slavery and Confederate feet, you see the end of the prisoner exchange program. This image that I usually teach with is this is where art really comes in. This is a triptych by Thomas Waterman Wood, The Contraband, The Soldier, and The Veteran. And in this picture here, you really see African-American subversives coming in like, I want to fight, I want to join. And it's their fight and making this an end of slavery and that Union war cause into fighting for abolition as part of its aim that causes surrender to have new terms. Because the old terms will never survive. The recruits here, proudly erect, proudly wearing that uniform, donning the colors. He's going to fight heroically and bravely, but also to be subject to intense racialized violence if they are captured. And if they are captured, they're not made prisoners, they're often killed. You see this in the early battles of Port Hudson, Louisiana, May 27, 1863. It's the first Louisiana that's bravely advancing across open ground under deadly artillery, 200 casualties. Some of those early men that die, they get replaced by new recruits. Milliken's Bend, though, is really see that Black soldiers will not be returned and captured as prisoners of war. Death is one of their likelihood. African-American troops from Louisiana, Mississippi, and are fighting with white cavalrymen and Iowa infantry. 45% of the Union's men are killed or mortally wounded from their wounds received. But it'll be Fort Wagner where we really see African-American men get killed, and those who are the white officers who fight alongside them not be treated with the same dignity and respect that was there in death as was before, because officers are supposed to be treated a certain way when they die. They are not to be buried in mass graves like Black soldiers would be treated. But Robert Goodsall would lead this Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and it's part of the movie Glory. If you haven't seen that, it's the best movie, still hands down in the African-American military experience. And it's because of his association with Black soldiers that Confederates deny him an officer's burial, and they declare, quote, "We have buried him with his ends." And he's buried without dignity in a mass grave on the beaches. And we see this regiment suffer about 50% casualties. And this is a national regiment where you have men from Pennsylvania across the nation fighting. It's not just Massachusetts men here. They are able to bring back and replace those numbers, but we really see a different kind of war, a different kind of surrender. And if you're a Black soldier, there's no surrendering. It's a death sentence. And this becomes especially clear at Fort Pillow, because Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest and his Confederate men shoot and kill a number of unarmed soldiers and officers who had surrendered, both Black and white. This is especially violent that even Confederate troops are disheartened by the bloodshed. And they respond violently to this bloodshed as well. And they don't want to have any participation in this. Out of the 262 soldiers that are there, 229 are killed. And it's this response of Fort Pillow that you will see, remember Fort Pillow, remember Fort Wagner, Port Hudson, but it will also lead to African-American soldiers in later battles to fight to death because they know what their fate is. And it also convinced white federal troops too, that maybe Black soldiers have a right to citizenship, and that surrender at all costs must matter. And this violence directed them really see enacted in some hard hand of war in those later campaigns. But it's the treatment of Black soldiers here that I find very instrumental in how surrender by whom matters. By white soldiers early on in the war, it's fine. There's manhood, there's dignity, there's the code of conduct. But when Black soldiers are there, that no longer applies. In addition to the Army, there are African Americans that serve in the US Navy. Unlike the Army, Black men can serve from the beginning in the Civil War in the Navy. They do not have any prohibitions, and you see about 19,000 serving. And what's interesting about those who join the Navy, oftentimes they secure the freedom by sailing to freedom. They would commandeer a ship, sail to a U.S. naval ship, surrender, collect the bounty for commandeering and take it out of Confederate service, the boat that they just took, and then they would enlist by serving on these ships. And when you're on a naval ship, race doesn't matter anymore. All men in active duty men to help make sure that it is sailable. So those who served in the Navy had a different experience than those who served on in the Army. And for them, they are most likely to survive the war unless there's some catastrophic explosion and destruction and sinking of the ship. But Robert Smalls of South Carolina would be one who sailed a planter through the harbor and secure his freedom. He would later become a congressman for South Carolina and the Beaufort, South Carolina region. Sonya Carter, Virginia, he too would sail to freedom in the Hampton Roads area and serve in the Navy. So we're seeing a lot of people serve in this way. So it's not just the soldiers' experience in the Army that matters, but we have Black men in uniform in the Navy as well. So their experiences with surrender will be different than the Army's. But it's instrumental because it shows that African Americans were part of the fight that led to Confederate defeat. And surrender start to matter even more. And this picture here is Appomattox Courthouse, April 1865, matter. And this picture also matters because none of the African American soldiers who were also a part of this campaign are located here. This is white men. But it's this surrender that starts to take the primacy of others. This is the start of many surrenders. It's not the only surrender. And David Silkenet's book, Raising the Right Flag, really talks about these ending surrenders, those that occur in North Carolina, but also the last ones. Stand Watie, who is a Confederate general of Native American descent, is the last continental U.S. surrender. But we don't talk about Stand Watie because he's Native American. And if we talk about Stand Watie and not Appomattox, then we have to extend it that the Confederacy had some Native Americans serve in the fight to preserve slavery. Then we have to talk about, well, what happened to the freed people in Indian territory then? And Elena Roberts really talks about that messiness that has to be taken in. If we keep it at Appomattox, we make it as white men and we center around this picture rather than the true diversity in those who were involved. We also forget about then the CSS Shenandoah, which is in Liverpool, England. That's the last official surrender. That's later in 1865. But then we had to talk, if we remember that, we had to remember then the international dynamics of the Civil War and that Appomattox wasn't the primary surrender. It's just the one that Lee surrenders at. So what gets remembered? What gets forgotten? And it's how and why in those processes. And we don't talk about the surrenders other than Appomattox. I think that's by design. And this brings me back to what you'll see in this exhibit by Sonya Clark. What happens if we remember this symbol? The truce flag in all these surrenders from the beginning to the end. And what happens if we remembered how this symbol endured? We can then talk about how the war has been remembered and the cultural wars that we've been engaged with from the end of the war to the present. Because we conveniently forgot this one, as we conveniently forgot that Appomattox was not the last surrender. So this opens up a question like, so what did we choose to remember? We chose to remember what we know now is the lost cause and a seating of the Confederacy in a win, remembering this cause that they fought for a noble fight, that they were honorers in there, and that they didn't fight over slavery. It was states' rights. But if you read the initial secession ordinances, you will know it's slavery. If you see how the political aims to forget what they were fighting for, forget the Cornerstone speech, forget the USCT troops and even the massacres that happened. It's that forgetting, that collective amnesia that's embedded in these monuments. And you can see from, thank you to the SPLC's chart, they occur at very particular moments. That first real spike is the spike that corresponds with 1890 to 1920. That is the height of lynching. That is the period of disenfranchisement of African Americans. That is the emergence of Jim Crow, the removal of Black political voices publicly from space, but also physically with their death and murder. The second wave, which is smaller but instrumental, is during what we call the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. And as African Americans are demanding inclusion in the nation with their white allies, oftentimes, as we see in Karen Cox's new book, No Common Ground, they are protesting in front of courthouses and in front of these Confederate monuments and defining a new type of geography that they are there, they are American, they must be heard. Their Civil War memory of Black fighting, freedom fighters of the Civil War generation were demanded a new type of politics. So a new type of war, a new type of immersion. And we are still dealing with these monuments. And when you see where these monuments are located, you can, this is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, or those dots. One, they're not just in the South. There are some all over the nation, including out west. My favorite Confederate monument actually was a plaque in Montreal, Canada, and it was in French, put up in 1957. These things are everywhere. But when you superimpose this map over the EGI map of lynching, those former states of Confederacy really dominate those locations. So lynching, the monuments, go hand in hand, and they're still fighting the Civil War over the memory of the Civil War. So what changed? One of the things that happened that this map really shows in that timeline, it kind of erases something that else is going on, and that's African-American resistance. And it starts really too, these cultural wars really begin not only just with the monuments, but the speeches themselves. And it fuels the resistance by African Americans. This monument here, it's kind of fuzzy to see, but that is the original Silent Sam at the dedication in 1913 at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, a campus where I received my PhD from, and one that when I was a student, I purposely avoided walking around this monument. I navigated around so I wouldn't have to see this. But at this dedication that of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the former students who were at UNC during the Civil War, some of them graduated, but a lot of them dropped out to fight in the Confederacy, including one of the final speakers of the day, Julian Shakespeare Carr. And Julian Carr, who was an industrialist, he was a UNC student. He drops out in 1864 and he fights as a private in the last years of the war. After the Civil War, he liked to embellish his war record, where he would say he was General Carr. He never rose to the rank of general. And Adam Dombey's book, The False Cause, really talks about his fabrications. But he was a New South industrialist and one who was instrumental in promoting the lost cause in the state of North Carolina. At his dedication speech, he took pleasure and talked about an incident which he talked about after the Civil War, where the drawing of the new lines and the new fights were being drawn. And he says when he was walking near where the statue was presently, he encountered an African-American woman who insulted a white woman on the streets. For this insult, he quotes, "I horsewhipped the Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds." That relishing in this audience of the dedication of Silent Sam, that he horsewhipped an African-American woman who's not named. And yet he still did this in defiance, even though he had to hide, and because there's federal troops there with a gun in hand ready to fight. But he boasted on that subordination of African Americans, going back to that cornerstone and what the war was about to the Confederate States of America. That was racial superiority and subordination of African Americans. And though freed, violence and these monuments go hand in hand to reinforce what the war should have been about. and that was African-American subordination. So as white Northerners reconcile with white Southerners over whiteness and brotherhood, they push out the African-American participation and allow for this kind of retrenchment and refighting of the Civil War that marginalizes and leads to such violences against African Americans. But African Americans resisted, and they did so from the beginning. The Calhoun Monument in South Carolina, Charleston, had two. The first monument, Calhoun number 1, was not really light. It was seated to the ground, and it's one that both white and Black Charlestonians fought against. But Black Charlestonians in particular, like Mamie Garvin Fields, the future South Carolina teacher, talked about what it meant to go by this thing. She's really, and she uses the N word in full, I blocked it out here, and that he was telling them that you don't belong. You need to stay in your place, and that know your place aggression and that dismissal that they have a right to be there. As children, she didn't like it. As adults, they didn't like it. But as children, she and her peers would pass by and made sure that they would fight back. They would mark it up. They would try to deface it as much as they could, because they refused to abide by what it was telling them to stay in their place. African-American protest was such with this monument, as well as whites' dislike of this design, that the Calhoun Monument number 2 comes up. It is put on a pedestal high in the air, and Calhoun's now standing, not sitting, and he's out of sight overlooking the city. And Mamie Garvin Fields and their friends said that they secured a victory. They got Calhoun up in the air so they could ignore him. But Calhoun number 2 came down this 2020, and it came down the stages because it was so far up in the air. But African Americans, past and present, challenged it. They celebrated its removal down. In Richmond, Virginia, African Americans under the Black newspaper, the Richmond Planet, also critiqued the Lee Memorial that's showcased here with one of its creative solutions during the George Floyd moment. Art projections on the base and reclaiming the space and reminding the city, but also the nation, that African Americans never accepted this monument. And around the dedication of the Lee Memorial, this is what the Richmond Planet had to say about the South wanting to remember these chieftains and that they were doing wrong in doing so. And it would slow down the progress of the nation if they continued to be bound by these chains. So African Americans in Richmond became ways that they fought against it. They said it in segregated spaces in newspapers that white Richmonders can ignore, and they did. But that didn't mean they weren't silent on it. And the Lee Monument is still under legal fight for its removal, but I have a feeling the courts will be siding with its removal. What do we do with the base, though? That's another question. And then Chapel Hill, following Charlottesville. Actually, following Charleston, when Dylan Roof went into Emmanuel AME Church during Bible study and massacred 9 people there, but spared the lives of some of the congregants to tell them to remember what he did, and his proud displays of the Confederate flag and the symbolism and why he selected this African American church. The fights over this monument started to come into play in 2015, June of 2015, weeks after the Charleston massacre occurred. Students at the University of North Carolina started to call for its removal, and it seemed promising. But the administration decided to not listen to the student population or its African American alumni. Instead, they started to target the students, allowed for monument defenders to come onto the campus with AR-15s to defend this. There would be a lot of tensions between the student population who would be peacefully protesting, the counter-protesting the armed protesters, and they would be attacked, and the school sat by and did nothing. And in fact, they not only, when it gets removed and it gets toppled by students after stale negotiations in 2018, the school administration again chooses to side with the Sons of the Confederacy, and they pledged the museum for this monument That also went through the courts in which they lost. But this quote in 2015 captured some of the sentiments of Black students at the time. And this is a lost Black PhD student in School of Ed. She embraced the Negro wench that Carr brought up because Carr's speech came to the surface as the work of historian, now then graduate student Adam Dombey. It was talked about before when Black students were there, but Adam Dombey's rediscovery of this was very important. It was a document that got taught widely and inspired. What to the Negro wench is University Day, using the line of Frederick Douglass and what to the slave is the 4th of July. This is what Shelby Dawkins Law is saying. I am the Negro wench descended from slaves. My ancestors unsung and buried in unmarked graves. They were Tar Heel born and Tar Heel bred, and their legacy will never die, even though they're Tar Heel dead. Using the symbol in the honor, the traditions of the school to remind both the administration and them that they are Tar Heels and they belong there too. Sam does not. So this protest, this removal, when this monument went down, I have the Carr speech on my website. It had 62,000 hits to it. It was being taught within a week. People wanted to know why, Sam. So Charleston led to some removals. Charlottesville led to some removals. George Floyd, though, surpasses all previous removals. And this is where the cultural wars of that Civil War and surrendering still fights. We are still surrendering these wars. The casualties now are these monuments. So this is a total map of all the monuments that are there. Those in red are others. Frederick Douglass, for instance, was removed. A federal statue to Christian Hague was toppled by counter protesters. So these don't really fit the mold. Those in green are to white supremacists and Southern colonialists. Christopher Columbus being the #1 person taken down, but also conquistadors and others tied to indigenous colonialism, indigenous genocide, as well as slavery. Those in blue, though, are the Confederate monuments that come down. And you notice a lot of those monuments that have come down are in the South and they're in front of courthouses, those sites where the sites of lynchings were, and not to be surprised, but some monuments included in out West, in Arizona, even in Illinois, Indiana, because the efforts of monuments were more pronounced in a national movement. When you add those with the others in green, we see even more monuments that have come down. We're looking at about roughly 300 so on monuments that have come down since last June, and they're still coming down. And we still have fights over removal because these are all the ones that are promised to be removed. They're in the process of being removed. So what happens with these? Or some are in litigation. A petition goes to the city council. If there's not a state preservation law at the time sealing its fate, it goes through another step. After there's a vote, 30 to 45 days later, it comes down. A lot of these are still in that negotiation, the removal process of it, because it is expensive to remove, but they are planned and scheduled to come down. And for me, I became part of history as well, because this monument that I'm teaching in front of at the University of Alabama comes down in 2020, and it was done without fanfare. It came down after a petition, and it was actually 2 petitions that had over 15,000 signatures on it, landed at the University of Alabama's administration. And without fanfare, they sent out an email on January 8th saying that they removed the plaques, because they removed the plaque from the boulder and 2 other Sons of the Confederate and UDC plaques that were on campus. We still have a signed Tiffany stained glass window in our special collections that you can still see. And it's a beauty. It's a beautiful window, but it's one that the UDC put up. And that's me within 10 minutes of that receipt of that email, touching the plaque and seeing years of protests to try to get this thing removed. Finally, the plaque removed. The next day, though, it was hoisted out of the air on a flatbed and put into storage. And sod was put down. Today, you can't tell what's there. And in its absence, I'm now able to have different kind of conversations about why was this monument removed? What is this history? And this is where I think Sonya Clark's artwork really brings us, not just campuses, but America. What do we do with the surrenders that are going on with these removals of monuments? What do we do next? Do we add contextualization? Do we remove? Do we listen to the communities that are asking for its removal and have been asking for its removal? Which memory matters? And if we're not going to remove it, how are we going to tell the fuller stories of what the Civil War was really about and these cultural wars over memory are still about? And here, this question, this art exhibition, Sonya Clark's beautiful art of this truce flag. What if this was the symbol that endured? What if this is the start of our conversation to talk to one another, not past one another, and actually listen to those who've been protesting these monuments since the Civil War? And what happens if we talk about what the Civil War was about, not how some chose to remember, but the people at the time fought about and over? And if we do that, if we embrace the surrenders and we embrace this flag, I think we can have different conversations than what we are having at present, and finally end this ongoing Civil War and the surrenders past and present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary, Dr. Green. That was an amazing way to kick off these exhibitions. And we should mention that today is the 8th, tomorrow is April 9th. So we're celebrating quite an important anniversary, actually. We're on the eve of a very good day in American history. Or yes, I don't want to put value judgment. It's not linear in that way. But so I just really appreciate, I see a lot of my colleagues from deCordova and from our statewide parent organization, the Trustees, who are on who have tuned in. And so I'm so glad to see you. People might have questions. Please put them in the Q&A box if any thoughts pop up. And I really appreciate it. Actually, anyone who does military history, I'm just like so humbled by, like the way that you move back and forth between the stories of an individual soldier and then the meta sort of picture going on is really, really helpful for us. It's something that we haven't yet offered our staff in terms of our support of this exhibition. So and of course your visual history as well, which is so one question that came up actually in a presentation I gave about the exhibitions yesterday was that I was slipping back and forth between the terms truce and surrender, especially between truce flag and surrender flag. It is referred to as both. I looked at the Smithsonian, which owns that big fragment, which calls it a truce flag. Yeah. But the person said, well, truce seems temporary. And is that actually, in fact, more appropriate because of what happened after the,
Yeah, so that is a good question. It goes back to those early stages of what these surrenders were, because they were saying truce that they would not fight again and that they would be exchanged. So it was like a temporary stop to fighting. And that waving the white flag was like, okay, you stop shooting at me. So stop the fighting so we can surrender that way. And so, but then the language starts going from the flag of truce to the parolees who are going back. They come on truce boats and truce transportations back. So they are allowed to go back and forth and cross lines. But as Black soldiers come in, those flags no longer become truce. You are no longer to re-engage at all. Instead, you are going to some of the state prisons like Andersonville and others. So you weren't even having the chance to go back to loved ones and possibly re-up. You're a full-out prisoner of war. So the way surrender itself and that flag was used and how it shifted during the war really matters. But I like the same thing with how it really comes out at the end with these formal things like Appomattox, because those men would have not seen it as surrender. They saw it as a truce. So they went home and they continued to fight, even though Grant and others thought it was okay. They're surrendering. We're done. So not calling the flag, firmly calling the flag surrender, allowing men to go back as if the war hadn't changed, as this flag wasn't slipping back and forth and these definitions change. Really caused that ongoing. So it, in the end, became temporary because we saw the violence continue. And I'm glad that person asked the question because it gets used both ways. But when you see the end of the war, that ongoing fight just continues because it wasn't treated that way by those who ended up leaving and going back home in defeat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the questions that hangs over the exhibition. Did the truce hold?
Mm-hmm.
And like, obviously, there's a literal way to interpret that, and then there's a sort of more polemical one. And I think Sonia tries to like leave it, tries not to like draw the lines too directly
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too. And for me as a scholar, I'm like, no, the war ended.
Right.
Like, there's clear boundaries. The war ended. It was 4 years. This nation held for 4 years. But this is where the war memory comes in. And that war is not so much on a violence, it's more of an ideological time, a memory one, even though violence is being used in southern states. They can do this as one of erasure and one of forgetting and one of memory, and not really do that work and to say like, okay, as long as we do this along whiteness, we get rid of African Americans, we can have this truce between white men. But for African Americans, they don't belong. They need to be suppressed. They can have to surrender here. And that's why I think that coming in her piece as a part of that ongoing tradition of Black resistance, from art to memoirs, I think she's really going into that. Like, did it really end? For whom did it end? To whom did the Civil War was allowed to be remembered here? And if we think about the who and the R and what was this war, we can then understand why Stand Waiting no longer fits, why those other surrenders and Nathan Bedford Forrest and all of his violence in Selma, Alabama doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
It's Lee. It's Gentleman Lee. It's this myth of him. That's what seals it. And the terms that Grant issued, not the other ones. And I think it's that selective inconvenience of forgetting and then using the monuments and the textbooks to ensure that generations are learning these selective remembrance and fabrications.
Yeah.
That's where that war comes in there.
Yeah. I'm actually so grateful that you shared that
Mm-hmm.
timeline, that sort of graphic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of them actually, because there's so many chapters that were there in that timeline that are not, well, not part of my education at least. You know, I'm sure they're taught in some places, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, very repressed.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why that timeline matters and when those things start to come up. And that's when states' rights as an issue for the war comes up. It's not at the time of the men who drafted those ordinances. They are really clear about slavery. I always have my students circle how many times slavery comes up. Who do they identify as enemies? And they're identifying like Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Like, what happened here? They're going after abolitionists and Northerners in a way. And they're using this very harsh language, but they're not saying we're fighting for states' rights and slavery was secondary or tertiary. It's that. And that subordination and racial language of where African Americans in the nation were. And Alexander Stevens addressed that it's the cornerstone. That is what they're fighting for. And how that falls apart in the surrenders and who gets to surrender and how you can kill African American soldiers because you know what? They don't deserve life. And that continues on after the Civil War as well, with the memory of lynching and those monuments going hand in hand.
I think that that's one of the things that is so powerful about Sonya Clark's work is that she's able to show how like very mundane, ordinary sort of symbols that we see all over the place, commonly found, um, really can, yeah, can erase histories, can shift ideologies. And so you've spoken a couple times about that like this flag, this symbol can be, its meaning shifts constantly depending on who's holding it, where it is positioned,
Yeah.
in what context, what moment exactly during this war. And so, and like, yeah, at one point we thought, well, Sonia's dream is like get the truce flag everywhere. So like, let's make bumper stickers. Let's have everyone driving around with it, like banners, like
Yeah.
sky writing, whatever. And then I was like, wait, no. But what if it's misinterpreted? What if someone thinks that we're like trying to rewrite history, and it's like, and
Yeah.
that's like the problem with, and it's totally abstract. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's abstract, but it's also politicized in a way that those who would see it probably would just ignore it. And you saw this on January 6th. Those symbols of the Confederacy are not going away. These defenders, and they're like, oh, the states' rights and my right to have this. Most people didn't know what those monuments were. Most people could not tell you what date that the nation seceded, what flag did the actual regiments of the Confederacy fought under, or that the battle flag that they're using is not the battle flag that most regiments fought under, or the states of the Confederate States of America official flag. There was 3 of them. Like, they couldn't identify that, but that symbol's so potent for a refusal to listen, a refusal to continue and to err. So for some individuals, this flag, while it should symbolize the ending of the Civil War, probably in this moment, after the last administration, would be co-opted and used like, yes, we're winning. You're fighting.
I see a chat coming in the chat, but actually, I was going to ask really briefly just that, like Sonya said that when she discovered the truce flag at the Smithsonian, she found that there's a fragment of it as well at there's a history museum at Appomattox. And she said when she called them, I think she said they had a very different story about this flag. And I know that you're a serious historian, you would never speculate, but I do wonder, I do really want to know what that wall text says next to, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while. I actually gave a talk there before the pandemic, and I forget, this is where I should have taken a picture, because usually I take pictures of everything and go there. But one of the things I find with museums is the docents. And you can get inconsistent messages between what the flag is. And I remember the Smithsonian one being different than when I saw it at Appomattox. And this is where I think it's that myth making that doesn't go away. How do you undo the myth? And at this point, 150 years of myth making. What do we do with that? We're actually going to be 161 this year. We're 2021, so we're the 160th anniversary of the Civil War this year.
That's right.
What do we do? And sometimes myths are hard to dispel. But one of the things I would say about Appomattox and the national parks writ large, they've gotten better and talked about the fuller stories of the Civil War. So while the truce flag might not be properly displayed, I know they have done other exhibits about the African-American experience at Appomattox and others. So I think it's an opportunity to update maybe the permanent marker and then continue on to have these conversations. But I think it's that conversation and talking. But I will say this, Sonya's flag and this truce flag, the size, the scale, using the dyes at the time that would have recreated, because a lot of these flags were homespun materials that people had. Yeah. So when you think about that and how it's just huge, it is beautiful. But on the back wall, there's in Confederate red a Benjamin Moore sign with his right on. I just remember that. Like, the paint's called Confederate red. Can we stop? So her taking that, reappropriating and transforming that, I think this is where art in this exhibition starts to really get us to think and ask these questions that we haven't been able to ask before.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, docents, your what you have shared with us today itself is actually part of our docent training yeah, exactly, so that we can really share this with this exhibition and these powerful works with our publics. So a question came in I wanted to share, which is great, because actually I wanted to, just before we close out and say goodbye, I wanted to turn to monuments again. Yeah. Very popular topic. And so the question from Linda says, does Dr. Green have any suggestions for how to use new monuments in place of those removed to educate Americans about the Civil War? So many of us have incomplete knowledge.
Yes, so one of the things that I have seen are the empty pedestals. Just taken off the top of it and just like then ask people like, well, what was on top of this thing? Ask the questions to have them question what was there. And then use that empty pedestal as a way to reascribe new meaning around it. And this is why I think the Lee Memorial is so powerful. People reclaimed it with graffiti. So it's covered in artwork. It's also, too, the projections on it. It has become a whole new monument now with
Right.
those projections and graffiti. People got married on it. You had basketball. That reclamation art and that power is, I think, if anything, when Lee comes down, he's going to come down. It's just waiting for the courts at this moment. Can we keep the base? Take him off of the top, but preserve the base. Make that the new monument, and the monument of Lee Contextualized, or Lee Memorial Part 2 or 2.0, and have that as the, why did people mark this up? What was this new art piece that was done by the community to heal? How can we use that as the space for conversation, not the one before that divided? So I think there's a way for new arts, repurposing the artwork of the empty pedestal to have this. And at the University of Alabama, the removal of the boulder, that empty space is another site for educators like me to say, like, what does it mean that we have an empty plot of grass here in between two flagpoles? That's where I think we can have newer conversations, but art is the way. I'm always about community art and community engagement and sculpture. And that is, I think, how we can change the conversations of what is removed and replaces those Confederate monuments, or as I like to call them, Jim Crow monuments, because that's when they came up.
Hilary, would you be interested in curating an outdoor exhibition at our sculpture park of an empty monument outdoor sculpture exhibition?
I would love that. Honestly, I think that Megan Kate Nelson really talked about the empty pedestal, and once I saw Richmond, I'm like, that's the way to go, because those things are huge. Like, what do you do with this massive base? And having community and engagement to make the new art piece and thing, and then preserve it. That, I think, is the way to move forward. And what Clark has done and others, I think that's an opportunity that we can do.
Yeah, it's so interesting. That question comes up a lot about permanence versus impermanence, but cloth itself can be monumental. It's not so impermanent. You know, people keep saying, and we have hair from thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it just requires a different kind of preservation.
That's right. Yes. For that, we're grateful to museum registrars.
Yes.
Well, our time is just about up. So I'll just close out by thanking you so much for being with us today, Dr. Green. And this was incredible. This is so helpful to us as the museum staff, hopefully to our viewers as well who will visit the exhibitions. The exhibitions are open starting Saturday until September. Please reserve an admission in advance for a timed entrance. And we'll have many more programs throughout the spring and summer. So check back for more. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for being in attendance. And thank you, Sam, and everyone for inviting me. This was great.
Our pleasure. Take care, Dr. Green. Bye.